Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see a very full room of people interested in arms control and strategic stability in the Euro-Atlantic region right now. I'm Heather Williams. I'm the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS, and we'll be chairing today's discussion. Before we begin, just a brief safety note. I want to share with you all our building safety precautions for those of you in the room. Overall, we feel secure in our building, but as a convener, we have a duty to prepare for any eventuality. I'll be your responsible safety officer for this event, and please follow my instructions should the need arise. Finally, please take a moment to find the nearest emergency exit. It's probably there or there behind me. The only other housekeeping items, this discussion is on the record, and that obviously goes for everybody online as well. We're going to have hear from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. If you do want to get involved in the discussion, and we would love for you to do that, to ask questions, please use the QR code that is behind you, and then I'll be fielding the questions as we go along. A very brief introduction about the Project on Nuclear Issues. It was set up in 2003 to develop the next generation of policy, technical, and operational nuclear professionals through outreach, mentorship, research, and debate. And I'm just incredibly proud of the next generation programming that we've done here, and in particular to our 2025 class of nuclear scholars, most of whom are in the room today. And I'm also looking around and seeing a lot of nuclear scholars and mid-career alumni. So it's great to see the PONI network out in force. Just to say a little bit about the report that we are launching today. This project truly was tracking a moving target and trying to understand strategic stability on the ground in the Euro-Atlantic region, prospects for arms control. Just recently in news about prospects for a peace settlement, the president's comments about denuclearization, but also Russia's ongoing nuclear threats all impact the issue that we were looking at. And I can tell you the project team rewrote this report many, many times as we watched the news and as events changed. But I think we've landed somewhere really impactful with some really important and creative ideas. And I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion about that. We are joined today by Amy Nelson, who is a senior fellow at New America's Future Security Program, Marshall Billingslea, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and Mark Newton, who is at the British Embassy here in Washington, D.C. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the main points from the report. It only came out Monday. There are hard copies outside, just in case you haven't had time to read it. Some of the main issues that we'll be talking about. In terms of the methodology, the way that we did this project was we came up with 6 potential futures for strategic stability in the Euro-Atlantic region, and it was all set in 2027. 4 of those scenarios looked at different adversary capabilities, but also looked at variation within coordination within the NATO alliance. Obviously, this is something that a lot of us have been tracking and have questions about. But we also developed 2 black swan scenarios. In one of these, there was a leadership change in Moscow, and in the other one, nuclear weapons were used. And we conducted a series of expert and next generation workshops here and in London. And we're very grateful to the support from the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for supporting this project. Our main findings, the primary finding from our workshop discussions in these scenarios was that competition with Russia will not necessarily end when the war in Ukraine ends. That competition might not involve military action or for further Russian aggression in the region immediately, but over time, that continued competition is something that we should expect. Another finding that we had was that Europe is poised to be a bigger player in strategic stability and arms control in the region. And one particular reason for this, which I see a lot of arms control experts in the room are probably familiar with, is that Russia for a while now has been insisting that the UK and France be included in any future arms control agreements. And so while here in DC we're often focused on China as a new arms control partner, there are other arms control partners that will likely be part of further discussions. Another finding we had was that arms control with Russia may be personality agnostic. Our scenario-based discussions found that even with a change of leadership in the Kremlin, meaningful arms control would still be a challenge. And then perhaps the most depressing finding we had from our scenarios was that the nuclear taboo is weakening. In our discussion of a scenario involving nuclear weapons use, the participants really struggled to uphold the taboo over time. And so all of these are worrying considerations, but we did also find some potential points of optimism in a way forward for arms control. Our recommendations. The first was that the US and Russia agreed to abide by New START central limits for 3 years and to do so through presidential agreement rather than through a treaty. Another one was that the US and Europe prepare to expand their conventional and nuclear deterrence capabilities. In some ways, this could actually help arms control. It could create leverage. It could create pressure on Moscow to engage. A third recommendation was that Europe develop a new arms control strategy and remain open to arms control dialogue, particularly with potential for time-bound arms control agreements. And then the last one, this isn't just an issue for nuclear possessors to engage with. The global south, non-nuclear weapon states also have a key role to play in helping to strengthen nuclear norms, for example, by calling out Russian nuclear saber rattling in the NPT PrepCom, which will begin next week, and also in the TPNW meeting of states parties. So that is a very quick rundown of a much thicker report that you can pick up outside, as I said. But with that, I want to turn it over to our panelists to start the discussion of this report, but also drawing on all of their own expertise on these issues. You have their full bios. All of them bring, I think, really exciting and different perspectives on arms control, from policy, practitioner, American, British, and European perspectives on these issues. And so we're going to go first to Marshall, and then to Amy, and then last hear from Mark, and then open it up for discussion. So thank you all again for joining. And Marshall, over to you to kick off the conversation.
Thanks. I think before getting into a discussion of policy prescriptions, we have to recognize the threat environment as it is, not as we wish it were. We're in a situation where Russia not only maintains the largest and most diverse nuclear arsenal in the world, but continues to systematically add to it and grow the size of its weapons, particularly in the theater nuclear type of capabilities, which are not constrained by the New START Treaty as it stands now. China is engaged in a massive secretive nuclear breakout. They had roughly 250 weapons or so deployed when I began negotiating on behalf of President Trump under the first administration on the nuclear file. They surged up to 400 a few years ago. They're now above 600 weapons, and all of our indicators suggest that they will field roughly as many deployed weapons as we currently field under the New START Treaty by 2035, 1,500 or so, or more. In fact, they may be on pace to exceed the number of strategic weapons that we currently are able to field. They certainly have more ICBM silos now dug than we do, and they have emplaced city buster megaton weapons in a number of those, which we currently don't do and don't have. One also cannot ignore the trajectory that Iran is on. Iran, by all of the latest estimates, now has enough highly enriched uranium that within a month or so, they're believed to be able to produce enough weapons-grade material to fuel 7 nuclear devices. So Iran is right on the nuclear threshold. And then we have North Korea, who continues to pursue its weapons and to improve its ballistic missiles, its intercontinental range missiles, with the goal of defeating U.S. missile defenses. For all of these reasons on the threat side, it's important that we recognize a few things. The United States no longer can treat China as a lesser included matter within our nuclear posture. We also have to recognize that there is now great potential for simultaneous aggression by both Russia and China, either in an opportunistic manner or in a coordinated manner. Further, we have to recognize that, in my view, the prospects for meaningful arms control are slim to none. And for these reasons, the United States, from its posture, needs to take the following actions. The current force modernization is essential, but it is not sufficient for the future environment. The number of targets is going up, and our ability to hold at risk those things which Putin and Xi prize is going down. We are going to therefore need to immediately begin the process of, which is why I don't agree with a 3-year policy moratorium. We'll need to immediately begin reopening the tubes on the Ohio-class submarines that were welded shut to meet the New START numbers and to in place Trident warheads, Trident missiles in there. We're going to have to MIRV the entire ICBM fleet. We're going to need to procure additional B-21 bombers and move the Air Force to a portion of the bomber fleet being on strip alert. We will need to look at other alternative. I operate from the assumption that we're not going to dig further silos, and so a road mobile ICBM solution needs to be examined very closely and carefully. By the way, these are all recommendations that were made by the Strategic Posture Commission. They were unanimous, bipartisan, Democrat and Republicans, six Republicans, 6 Democrats, 6 men, 6 women, and everything I've said so far is I think, unanimously agreed. We're also going to need, so now I'm going to offer just a few final thoughts. The sea launch, the nuclear sea launch cruise missile, which was initiated under the first Trump administration and is being pursued under this administration, and actually was grudgingly endorsed at the tail end of the Biden administration, is essential for us to have to deal with the saber rattling and the escalatory risks that we face, particularly from Russian theater level weapons. President Trump has also announced the pursuit of a Golden Dome missile defense, sort of echoing back to President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative concept. Obviously, a great deal has changed since Reagan announced that initiative. Many of the trend lines for the better, making it far more possible to deploy a space-based missile defense for the United States and potentially for our allies. So in my view, that also very much needs to be pursued, because at a minimum, we need to take the threat of a limited coercive strike off the table for both the Russians and the Chinese. And so even a modest space-based system, I think, would provide that level of assurance and that level of requirement from a deterrent standpoint for Putin and Xi to understand that they cannot threaten a handful of warheads. If they're going to go, they're going to have to go all in with us. Final point. We don't want to increase our reliance on nuclear weapons. But in order to avoid reliance on nuclear weapons to deter aggression, we are going to have to make investments in our conventional military capabilities to deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan, which is increasingly appears imminent, and further to deter Vladimir Putin from re-invading Ukraine and or NATO allies in the not so far future, not so distant future. So thanks, Heather, for that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Slightly grim picture of the world, but as you said, we need to deal with the world as it is, not how we want it to be. And I think you've painted a really fulsome picture about adversary nuclear expansion and one potential approach for addressing that. For another perspective, Amy, going to turn it over to you, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather, and to your excellent team for having me today. Well, I'm trying to create a seamless transition here between your assessment. I would say what is a capabilities-driven assessment of the strategic landscape. And I'm going to offer another assessment of the strategic landscape, but from a different perspective. And the report talks about strategic stability in that it talks about what is the role of arms control for strategic stability in a future state of the world, I guess, is kind of where we're landing. But this concept of strategic stability and its relationship to arms control is actually really complex and nuanced and rich. And I think oftentimes we use strategic stability as shorthand for a single destabilizing event that could disrupt the system. And so what I want to focus on is the system and how I see it right now. So strategic stability, deterrence, and arms control, of course, they go together by design. They were always meant to go together, where deterrence is supported by arms control. And if it holds, no actor has an incentive to strike first or to escalate. And this is a condition central to global security. Arms control in all this plays a role. It codifies the mutual restraint and provides mechanisms to reinforce the deterrence. And I say this, though it may be obvious, these three concepts were always designed to work together. It was a never, pick your favorites sort of game. And then when we think about stability, we can conceptualize three types of strategic stability that roughly correspond to near, medium, and long term. So near-term first strike stability, right? This is the big one. Neither side believes it can benefit from attacking first, and each side is actually confident that it can absorb a first strike attack and retaliate effectively. And in this, when this holds, there is no incentive for a preemptive strike. For crisis stability, when this holds, tensions don't spiral because both sides actually understand each other's red lines and there are off-ramps. Confidence crises, we have confidence that crises won't escalate rapidly, and this is all reinforced by signaling, communication, and escalation control. And then finally, arms race stability, where actors don't feel pressured to rapidly build or modernize weapons due to cost or diminishing strategic gains. This is where mutual restraint prevails and states avoid buildups due to diminishing returns. So the current challenge, and the report gets into this extensively, the Cold War allowed for relatively clear bilateral calculations of strategic stability. It could actually be assessed holistically over the entirety of the system or significant portions of the system that were most relevant to the calculation of strategic stability. But today's world is unequivocally messier. It's multipolar, some might say multi-system, and it is full of gray zones. Technologies like hypersonics, AI, autonomous systems, and cyber tools are further complicating the stability equation. Hypersonic glide vehicles, for example, blur response times and introduce payload ambiguity. Cyber weapons introduce attribution challenges and the possibility for sub-threshold conflict. And AI and lethal autonomous weapon systems stand to reduce decision time and human control, which stands to weaken escalation control. On top of all this, arms control is eroding. INF is gone, New START is tenuous, and there is no consensus on governing either AI or cyber. So I want to circle back to this idea of strategic stability as the descriptor of the international system, the character of the system, which we want to be stable. We can think of the international system like a well-managed economy, right? It needs to be able, much like the economy, to absorb shocks or resist collapse, and it has to be able to adapt over time. From our economy, we don't expect zero volatility, but we expect resilience. Arms control norms and nuclear postures have functioned like monetary policy levers, managing risks at the margins of this system. And much like interest rates, arms control can adjust incentives, manage risk, and prevent collapse. So with this in mind, we can consider two futures where arms control is concerned for this system. We can evolve arms control to regulate not just weapons, but destabilizing technologies, to provide transparency into all matters, including intent. Or alternatively, in the opposite extreme, we abandon arms control. And this means waiting for the system to restabilize on its own term, likely through crisis or conflict. So without arms control, that is to say, the system could eventually stabilize, but at a far higher cost. And there is a risk of collapse in this alternative world. So I would say that arms control remains vital. Even if the system recalibrates itself, we want to reduce the volatility. We want to be able to consistently signal our intentions to reduce uncertainty in the strategic environment and to set boundaries around destabilizing behavior to the best of our ability. So it's not really about freezing progress on the system's evolution, but about managing the path through uncertainty in an increasingly uncertain environment. Now, where emerging technologies are concerned, I would caution we don't want to overreact, but we also don't want to underestimate. So the instinct consistently has been that as new technology emerges, to treat it as inherently or potentially destabilizing and de facto in need of arms control solutions. This is overblown but not baseless, but we should pay careful attention to it because it risks diverting limited attention and resources. This is our techno-security bias, essentially, where we overestimate technology in the short term and underestimate its effects in the long term. This is Amara's law. CRISPR, AI, hypersonics, and drones, none of these are destabilizing by default. And stability isn't necessarily broken by the existence or introduction of these new technologies, but it very much depends on how we use, deploy, and signal them. The real question is, how are these tools implemented, governed, and signaled? And that's where arms control plays a role. So cyber, for one, can be stabilizing, actually, if it's used defensively, but can escalate quickly if attribution is unclear. And hypersonics are destabilizing mostly due not to their speed, as many have discussed, but due to their nuclear ambiguity. Drones are a mix. They can be used offensively, and when they can be destabilizing, but if they're used for defenses, they're quite stabilizing, or they could be. And lethal autonomous systems, these can be used defensively to enhance stability, while offensive systems actually reduce trust. So to close out, I want to say that strategic stability is a descriptor of the system. We used to be able to calculate it holistically, but I think those days are done. I think we need to pay closer attention to cases in which strategic stability is disrupted. That, of course, depends on perception. And stability itself, with that in mind, stability is a shared concept. It only exists if we all think it exists and agree on what it is. It's meaningless otherwise. And with that in mind, I think we do need a renewed and shared understanding of what this means, of what strategic stability means, especially among nuclear armed power, and we need the political will to sustain it. Thank you.
Thank you. And your comparison to economics made me think of a phrase I'm guessing we've all been hearing a lot lately. Markets don't like uncertainty. And I would say strategic stability, nuclear weapons also don't like uncertainty.
That's right.
And so I really appreciate you bringing in this angle. It's a bit more behavioral, as you say. I think Marshall was capturing some capability-based approaches about how we're all trying to figure out how to live with a lot of the current geostrategic uncertainty. So that was I think you did a good job, good transitioning from Marshall on that. Thank you. And now hearing from, I think we still count the UK as part of Europe. I do. Hearing from, sorry, I just had to start with Brexit. Turning over now to Mark Newton from the UK Embassy. Thank you very much for contributing to this project and sponsoring it. I'm really looking forward to hearing a view from the other side of the Atlantic on these issues. Mark.
Thanks, Heather. Thank you to CSIS. For hosting us. Thank you for the PONI project, which has been kind of incredibly helpful in just bringing on a new generation of thinkers on the nuclear issues, and it's heartening to see so many people in the room. Thank you for mentioning Brexit. We are getting on for 10 years from that vote, and remarkable that it continues to have that level of salience. We are still in Europe. Not aware that the country has physically moved. Thank you to my fellow panelists as well, and I'll try and find a space somewhere in the middle. It's very rare that I will disagree with anything that Marshall says, but I do think he's slightly wrong on arms control. I think the prospects are slim, but they're not none. We should always seek out opportunities to progress any measures, frankly, that will increase strategic stability or the prospects for arms control. The end of the Cold War yielded political conditions for such measures that few of us predicted at the time, and revealed how important it is, frankly, to be prepared for negotiations even when the circumstances leading to them make success seem unlikely. So, conscious of where we are today, it's very difficult to be optimistic about the end of the war in Ukraine, optimistic that will lead to major arms control breakthroughs. Much, of course, depends on the nature of any settlement, including whether it leads to a just and enduring peace. But we do welcome the opportunity that the new administration has created for us to have a push towards peace there, for a push towards a ceasefire and negotiations. And I don't want to predict where those negotiations might end up. As one of the key findings from the project and the paper highlights, and I think it's a really good report, so thank you for it. Competition with Russia is very unlikely to end. Russia has not altered its territorial ambitions for control of Ukraine, nor its deep hostility towards NATO. My new government that came into power last year has been in the process of writing its strategic defence review, and I expect that that will come out in the very near future. It would be very foolish of me to predict, particularly on the record, what's going to be in it. But, conscious as someone who is capable of doing very foolish things, I'd be amazed if it did not highlight the threat from Russia as the principal piece that the UK has faced and will continue to face. There has been no other country that has murdered British citizens in our homeland in the last decade. And we have to be clear-eyed, as Marshall was saying, about the nature of the world that we're living in. There are some tactical considerations that might make negotiations more attractive to Russia. For example, to secure some breathing room for limited nuclear competition while it rebuilds a depleted conventional force. But its wartime economy is not going to end anytime soon. It has fundamentally changed the nature of its domestic production, and it will not go back from that in short order. And it is IMF Spring Meetings Week, so good that we're mentioning the economies as often as we are. I mean, none of that alters the fundamental reality that Russia poses a threat to European security and will continue to pose a threat to European security. Russia has continued to develop new and sometimes novel nuclear systems. It was in this building last year that Mike Turner was talking openly about anti-satellite space capabilities in the nuclear domain. So I can talk about that openly in a way that we can't talk about some other things. Russia's track record of adhering to arms control regulations, including New START, which the document quite clearly mentions the good work that Frank Miller and Eric Edelman have done in highlighting how many times Russia has broken its responsibilities. Doesn't bode well for cultivating an environment of trust for any new measures. But we've got to still try. And the best prospect for arms control in the near term may lie with extending New START. It may lie with new verifiable measures to ensure Russian compliance. We'll need to approach any such kind of possibilities with both good faith but a huge amount of scepticism, ensuring that our respective nuclear modernizations continue at pace. But it is in our interests to at least try, and I think that aligns with the paper's recommendations. There are some opportunities. As the paper also outlines, the P5 process forms a part of building greater trust and kind of reducing misunderstanding on the road to more substantive agreements. The P3 has worked very hard to use that forum to build towards incremental trust and confidence building measures. If discussions on strategic stability make progress, we will need to consider how we use the P5 forum to fit into wider political efforts. The NPT also remains vital for stemming new proliferation, but prospects for arms control remain really unclear. And while that's the case, the UK will continue with a major programme of nuclear modernisation that we have embarked on. In that respect, our policy remains unchanged in recognising that the UK will continue to have an independent, minimal, credible nuclear deterrent declared to the defence of NATO, and that we believe that's essential to our security and those of our NATO allies. We, for a long time, set out that minimal, credible statement with an emphasis on the minimal. I think in recent years, we have been absolutely clear that the emphasis is on the credible. And in our last defence review, we set out that we would be increasing the size of our nuclear stockpile from the previously declared 225 to 260. We are continuing to think through what else we might need in the nuclear domain in the future. And I think one of the interesting recommendations in your report is looking at whether or not the UK might consider an air leg going forward. In these times of greater instability, we also need to look ahead and work to ensure that the existing arms control architecture, including in the Euro-Atlantic, can be adapted to meet the challenges of the day. Those efforts will have to take into account new technologies, as being set out earlier. We need to make sure that we are thinking through kind of novel threats and escalation pathways. P5 states, again, have a key role in that, and need to do it with the whole of the international community. Again, another place where I think your report is right is in highlighting the growing role of the global middle ground in that respect. So, of course, we will be open to discussions on arms control. We will always engage with steps to improve strategic stability. But it is particularly important, given that we do maintain that minimum amount of destructive power, to make sure that we guarantee our deterrent remains credible and effective against the full range of threats that we face. Whatever happens in the short term, we will continue to champion strategic risk reduction and seek to create dialogue. We will also make sure that we have a credible deterrent against all the threats that are faced against us. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you. And one of your last comments reminded me of another point from the report I think it's worth highlighting. It's about there is still an existing arms control structure. There are still existing institutions. And one of the things that we did in the project was we had a workshop specifically for early and mid-career participants, Next Gen, and they asked a really fundamental question that it paused me in my tracks a bit, where they said, how hard should we be fighting to preserve what's left? And for them, that included the NPT, MTCR, Vienna document, P5 process, NATO. And it was a very different discussion among Gen Z, the early to mid 20-somethings. And I thought it was a really valuable contribution to make us say, well, let's look at what is still out there. What is worth fighting for? What should we really be trying to keep? Obviously trying to get, abiding by New START at least until it expires in February. The Vienna document was something else that I think generated a lot of support going forward from all of our workshops on the conventional side, but then obviously also the NPT as well. So I just wanted to add that observation. Really great questions coming in, so I'm going to dive right into them. The first question I'm going to pose to Marshall and then to, Amy, also be interested in your views weighing in on this. This comes from Stephanie Stapleton, Center for Naval Analyses. To what extent does the pursuit of more expansive missile defense capabilities factor into the future of strategic stability, particularly in Europe? And you had mentioned Golden Dome, lots of questions going around about Golden Dome, so I'd be interested to hear your views on that, Marshall.
Well, missile defense exists and has been proven effective in a number of ways. We, the United States, currently only have, I think it's around 40 interceptors deployed, a few handful at Vandenberg and a number in Alaska. They've dug 20 new interceptor sites, but there are no interceptors to yet go in those. But again, that takes you to 60. And with hypersonics and other things, we have to recognize that a ground, a defense using ground-based interceptors is challenged. But we also have existing layered defense capabilities with Patriot, with THAAD, with the Aegis system, including Aegis ashore deployments in Europe and in working with the Japanese as well. So missile defense will continue to evolve and will factor into our national calculations. The evolution of both Russian and Chinese integrated air and missile defense is part of what drove the UK to recognize that the increase in their stockpile is necessary to maintain that credibility. That is something that we also have to factor in. Don't mistake me for saying we shouldn't look at arms control options in the future. I personally believe that the Chinese decision to test a fractional orbital bombardment system from a ground-launched ICBM is a very destabilizing first strike decapitation capability. And we ought to look to arrive at an agreement between the three powers that we're not going to do that, as an example. I believe that the NPT is essential and is under grave threat. And not just from whom you might expect, but Polish discussion of pursuing their own nuclear weapons capabilities, South Korean discussion likewise trouble me because that really, I think, does go in completely the wrong direction. And I believe that the alternative solution of providing them expanded assurance by deploying warhead storage areas in both South Korea and Poland is probably the right alternative approach. But that said, in terms of negotiating any form of strategic limitations, first and foremost, we need to divine and decide what our own requirements are. Unless you know what your needs are, you don't know what you're negotiating against. And as China in particular continues to be non-transparent and to arms race, let's be clear, Russia and China are arms racing. The United States is not. We need to understand where the Chinese intend to go and whether they intend to stay there. I've intimated that they may not intend to only pursue parity with the United States and Russia. They may intend to deploy superior numbers. And so these will be factors going forward. But for all of these reasons, and given the many known unknowns as well as the unknown unknowns, I believe the prospects for strategic nuclear limitations are close to zero at this stage.
Amy, any reflections on your side about how missile defense might shape thinking about strategic stability in Europe?
Sure, but I also just want to point out, I agree that that it would be helpful and stabilizing to know what China's intentions are in and around its nuclear program. So we have that commonality between us. So thinking systematically about missile defenses and our trinity of concepts, arms control, deterrence, and strategic stability, the original idea was that comprehensive missile defenses were destabilizing, right? Because you could make, you could render the damage from a first strike null, right? So you weren't then both sides weren't then able to hold one another at risk, which was a fundamental tenet that held all these concepts together, right? So the concept of comprehensive missile defenses then, and as far as I know now, still is potentially very destabilizing. So I would say destabilizing and also like insanely expensive, right? And we're not even clear if it's technologically feasible, so.
There's a lot of questions coming in about cost and modernization, and we'll get to that in a second. But Mark, I did notice that when Marshall said Russia and China are arms racing, we, the U.S., are not, you seem to be nodding in violent agreement.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think all three
Yeah.
of us are in agreement on kind of wanting to be clear about Chinese intent. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the number of Chinese warheads that have been developed in the last decade, I mean, the trend line is very clear. That's certainly far in excess of anything that we, the French, the Americans are doing. It's very hard to look at what Russia has been doing for the last decade, but in particular has been doing for the last 2 years and saying it's not arms racing. I mean, it's moved its entire economy to be on a war footing. I don't think that needs kind of me to set it out. I mean, I think it's very apparent in their actions.
If I can draw you out on this a little bit more, though, because I often notice in NPT discussions in particular, the U.S. often does get criticized for arms racing, and when the U.K. announced the change in its stockpile cap that you referred to, that also was brought up in NPT context as, well, you're expanding your arsenal too. So do you think, is this a narrative issue? Does the U.S. government, and maybe the Brits as well, need to be getting more information out there? Or what do you think is really going on there in terms of perspectives or perceptions about what arms racing is?
I think that's a very fair comment. I mean, I think one of the things about having a relatively low level of a warhead stockpile in the first place is that when we increase it even a little, people can point to a percentage number and say it is a kind of vast increase. The actual number of warheads in the stockpile, and not even number of warheads, cap on the ceiling of how many warheads we're going to conceivably produce, is still substantially lower than the amount that the Chinese are producing every year. And yes, trying to make sure that we get our narrative out is critical. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we try and appear in as many forums as possible. It's one of the reasons why I'm very grateful for your report. But to try and compare what the West is doing with what the Chinese and the Russians have been up to is, I think, a false comparison.
Mm-hmm. So we are going to turn to modernization and the cost of all of this now. One of the questions, this is specifically from Marshall, comes from Doug Otino from the U.S. Air Force. And he points out that you are offering a grim but honest threat assessment and calling for a host of capabilities, including human capital, investments, conventional capabilities. But with those priorities in mind, do you think that arms control could supplement some of the goal of restoring strategic stability and perhaps have cost saving?
I think from a theological standpoint, yes. And I choose that word deliberately. But there are certainly costs associated with the types of measures that I've suggested. But let's keep in mind, and different people with different motives estimate the percentage of the defense budget that go to our nuclear weapons structures. But if you recognize that the B-21, for instance, will perform a wide range of conventional missions, then you probably don't include those kinds of figures, and you really are in the single percentage digits in terms of overall DoD budget that is devoted to the nuclear posture. For the Air Force in particular, given Doug's question, the recommendation that we move to the air-breathing leg going on a form of a partial strip alert has got significant manpower issues for the Air Force. The Air Force is not currently structured or manned to be able to perform that mission. The Strategic Posture Commission recommended that this occur at the time that the B-21 enters into service. So there is some time to adjust, but we have to recognize that in this uncertain world, these are essential, these are necessities to defend the American people and to honor our extended deterrence commitments to our allies.
Picking up on the allies point, Mark, there's a question specifically for you from Shane Ward at Georgetown asking how you would respond to allies who are now looking to the UK to carry a greater burden, and to what extent can existing UK capabilities fill that gap, both nuclear and conventional? But then also, I'm adding on to it, if you can also speak to the cost factor. I said in a panel discussion recently that the NHS is the national religion of the UK, from at least my time there, and I love the NHS, don't get me wrong, but I often had thought that the UK in particular would support increases in defense spending as long as it never comes at the cost to anything like the NHS or social welfare. Do you think that assessment might be changing, and is there a greater willingness to continue to increase and sustain defense spending on the part of the UK?
So I might be foolish enough to talk about the Strategic Defence Review. Yes. On the record. I'm definitely not foolish enough to talk about the NHS. On the record. I think what is very clear is that Europe can't expect the US to care more about European security than Europe does. I think we all recognise that there has to be an increase in the amount of money that Europe is spending on defence. The UK has just announced its largest increase to its defence budget since the end of the Cold War. We've seen a range of other European partners do exactly the same. As we look ahead to the NATO summit in the summer, there is a lot of work going on as to what the next defence investment pledge and series of other defence pledges might be. I think it is important that NATO as a whole and the European parts of NATO recognise that we have got much more to do looking ahead, conscious of the security environment that we're in. And, I should have said in answer to your previous question, I mean, you look at the range of new nuclear warfighting systems that the Russians are investing in. You look at their demonstration of kind of irresponsible nuclear signalling during the conflict of the last couple of years. We need to be able to make sure that we can rise to that challenge. Now, I don't think there is any question over the US continuing to provide that extended nuclear deterrence to Europe. I hope that continues to be in place in perpetuity. Much as I'm proud of the UK's nuclear efforts, and much as the French are equally proud of their own, I don't think what we currently do can replace the US's nuclear deterrence in the region. I do think conventionally we need to be having a conversation about what more Europe can do and where we can stand up. And that strategic defence review that I mentioned will be, I expect, very clear about us prioritising what we do in the Euro-Atlantic. It has explicitly by design been focused on NATO first in terms of what we do, and my Defence Secretary has said that on a number of occasions. So I think in the conventional space there's a long conversation to be had. I recognise that the US is constantly trying to work out how it divides its forces between EUCOM, CENTCOM, INDOPACOM, and the challenge that the Chinese pose continues to grow, and so there has to be a dialogue there. I don't want to specify kind of precisely what capabilities it might focus on, but I do think that the UK is very clear that we will do our best to rise to that challenge.
Just an observation I wanted to throw out there. I think one of the really great benefits and contributions of the Strategic Posture Commission was laying out the case and being very explicit about what Russia and China are doing, getting into detail as much as possible and talking about the stakes. And I think that those big public-facing documents can play a really important public service in doing that. And it sounds like we can expect something similar from the SDR when it comes out, but from a British perspective, obviously. But I think that is an important contribution that I certainly am looking forward to in the field. Question, I do want to just stay with the modernization, the cost issue for a second, and bring Amy into the discussion in terms of how arms control, if it can help offset any of these costs. And so we have a question from Daryl Kimball at the Arms Control Association about the recent CBO report saying that the 10-year cost of nuclear modernization is now at $946 billion, and that does not include recent Sentinel cost overruns. And so do you think that engaging in arms control might help mitigate any of those costs, or how that might interact with modernization? And then I might throw in a few thoughts on that one as well.
I certainly think arms control could help, although modernization is often its own animal, right? So initially that was the deal that was done to get New START ratified, a commitment to the modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and it's in progress and ongoing. So it can be a very difficult ship to turn around. But of course, this pressing need, it's driven by this sense of urgency, right? That we need our safe, reliable, secure arsenal, and maybe even a bigger one, right? So, and it's the bigger one that we really want to avoid right now in terms of adding additional cost. But traditionally, yes, arms control is a tool that serves that purpose.
I was going to say, I completely agree. Historically, arms control can save money.
Yeah.
However, you need a willing partner to do it. And I certainly wouldn't suggest unilateral cuts on the part of the U.S. The pause that we are recommending, I don't think would bring any cost savings, because in the report we're also recommending moving ahead with the program of record in a nuclear and conventional buildup as well. But if you have a willing partner, or more than one, and can get back to that meaningful arms control, not just performative, then that might be an opportunity.
The use of the word partner is something that I probably don't agree with at all. You don't negotiate arms control agreements with partners. You negotiate arms control agreements with adversaries. And we have, in the form of Russia, an enemy that has broken, I think, every single agreement they've ever reached with us. And in the case of China, you have a country that also is violating multiple international arms control arrangements, and further just refuses to have the discussion. They are not going to talk until they've reached or surpassed us in terms of numerical parity. We need to look actively at ways to stop that instinct, to cause them to reevaluate. And here I go back to what I said, which is that we don't want to increase our dependency on nuclear weapons, but in order not to, we've got to field sufficient conventional forces. And in particular, we need to field systems that give the Chinese pause. Right now, they're greatly concerned with the Army's Typhoon medium-range ballistic and cruise missile system, which we were banned from having under the INF Treaty, but we now have, since Russia violated that treaty and clandestinely deployed multiple INF systems. So looking at conventional missile strike capabilities and other things that we can field, including in Europe, that give the enemies pause, that increase their desire to sit down at the table to talk, is, I think, precisely the kind of stabilizing actions that we can take on the conventional side.
I think also to your point, something you just said sort of reminded me, right? We're not in a space of doing quantitative reductions right now, and I don't think we will be. Let's say for if I had to bet, a minimum of 10 years. Right? We're just not in a position to do unilateral or to negotiate quantitative reductions. And in fact, I would argue that arms control has a stabilizing effect, not as a function of the limitations it sets to the size of states' arsenals, but as a function of the information it provides. And if the concern right now is strategic stability, then that transparency function of arms control is paramount. And then hopefully the quantitative reductions can follow in the future.
That gets to a question here from Amy Wolf. If this administration takes a different approach to Russia and builds, I don't want to call it an alliance, I don't want to call it a partnership now either, but if this administration gets closer to Russia, would that change your assessment that quantitative reductions are unlikely for the next decade?
I mean, what does closer mean? And yeah, that's an impossible question to answer. I don't have anything good to say about that. I'm sorry.
I would, please go ahead.
I would offer, you said something which I agree with. So even when New START expires, and presuming that it isn't, that there's some political arrangement doesn't extend it, there are artifacts of the Cold War relationship that we had with the Soviet Union and the Russians that should be maintained. So having a nuclear risk reduction center, having a hotline, engaging in advanced notification of ballistic missile launches so we avoid misperception about what's occurring. These are matters of transparency that are fundamentally important. Unfortunately, we have none of those with the Chinese. And so pursuing dialogue, and with the Russians, pursuing dialogue, one of the observations I made when I was the envoy for President Trump was that it probably was a mistake for the United States to cut off all dialogue with the Russian general staff, because the Khrushchevian iron kernel mindset that they displayed during the negotiations, including profoundly ignorant and wrongful assumptions about how we operate our nuclear deterrent forces, you can clear up those misperceptions by engaging in discussions. That doesn't necessarily mean you have an arms control framework that you're operating from, but there is, I think, value in the discussions to avoid some of the more obvious misperceptions.
Again, this was a theme that really came out from our report discussions, which were that there is this distrust of Russia. Even if Trump tries to move closer to Putin just isn't someone to be trusted. He's proven himself that over time. And so how long any sort of relationship would last should be questioned. But also getting to the point about potential misperceptions with the Chinese, from my perspective, these are fantastic things to talk about in something called strategic stability dialogues.
Exactly.
And the previous administration, and in your efforts with the Russians as well,
and the Chinese,
those attempts were made and were repeatedly rebuffed. And so
we
not
had a good
having
discussion with the Russians.
Yes, but the
and
Chinese are.
We actually had a phased process in place with the Russians, which the Biden administration threw away on day one by just extending New START for 5 years without condition. It's unfortunate, and there's no going back on that. But we made no progress with the Chinese.
Shifting back to Europe, a question from Mark about potential for a European conventional arms control strategy. This question comes from Frank Kuhn at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Do you see any opportunities for an autonomous, independent European conventional arms control policy with Russia that might not involve the United States? Or do you think conventional arms control in Europe would have to include the U.S. for the foreseeable future?
I don't think the US is the variable in that question. I mean, I think it goes back to the ability to have a trusted agreement with the Russians. I mean, as Marshall has said, as your report quotes Frank and Eric on, the number of agreements that have been reached with the Russians that the Russians have then chosen to ignore. I don't think at the moment the situation in Europe is one where we are likely to want to be fooled by Russia again. And whilst we recognise that, frankly, we do want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to explore ways to retain and renew arms control expertise and existing mechanisms, we have to be very clear-eyed about the way in which we're doing it. So, I mean, yes, in theory, it's something that is possible. In practice, we have an adversary in Russia that I don't believe would enter credibly into those conversations.
And let's be clear, Russia is today violating the Vienna Agreement, the Vienna document. Russia violated the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty repeatedly. Even when the Clinton administration renegotiated that treaty twice to expand the thresholds for their deployments in the so-called flank regions, they still violated it. Some of our European or NATO allies on the Eastern Front have realized that buying into things like landmine bans and cluster munition prohibitions were probably pretty stupid ideas. And so they've now exited those treaties because they recognize that when Russia engages in offensive operations, they send human waves, and they need landmines and they need cluster munitions to defend themselves. And so I think the prospects for conventional arms control in Europe today, given that there is a war raging in Europe today, are even less than the prospects for some kind of nuclear arrangement.
Final question for Marshall and Amy. What would be your single recommendation to the current Trump administration on arms control? And for Mark, one of the recommendations of the report is for NATO to revisit its arms control strategy, develop a stronger arms control strategy of arms control and deterrence, really working in tandem. What would be one thing that you would want to see in a new NATO arms control strategy? But Marshall, start with you on if you were advising the administration on arms control.
And I think, as I've said, you have to understand what your force requirements are before you can then proceed to negotiate. And so the sooner the administration adopts a nuclear posture review and a missile defense review, the better. So I would strongly encourage them to actually operate on the basis of the Bipartisan Posture Commission as the starting point, and then to progress from there. I would further encourage them to reinforce the pressure on NATO. It really is unacceptable that a third of our NATO allies are not yet spending 2% of GDP on defense. And while I think that NATO will move to a 3.5% goal at the upcoming summit, we've got laggards that need to catch up, particularly our friends to the north.
Amy, one recommendation?
Could I do two?
Yes.
Resume strategic stability dialogues, try to reinitiate with China as well, but also consider the role of an arms control agreement in whatever ceasefire deal is currently being negotiated in Ukraine, right? The CFE, the creation of the OSCE, all came out of a wartime mentality, the conclusion of conflict, the end of a conflict is prime opportunity for arms control.
Mark, what should NATO do?
So I started by saying I was going to slightly disagree with Marshall on something. I'm going to finish by saying I can entirely agree with Marshall. I mean, the thing that NATO should be doing is spending. The thing that NATO should be doing is making sure it's not just hitting that 2% target, but it's agreeing a more demanding target going forward. The UK is now at 2.5%. We've agreed 3% in the next Parliament. I would very much hope to see NATO set a more stretching target and for every member of it to meet it.
So, continue to prioritize enhancing deterrence, conventional and nuclear, increase spending, follow through on modernization and some of the other recommendations in the Strategic Posture Commission that the program of record necessary but not sufficient, so might need to slightly expand, but also staying open to arms control opportunities and trying to re-engage potential partners. I'm going to find a better word for it, I promise. Trying to find other potential partners for things like strategic stability dialogues.
Frenemies.
Frenemies, okay. That's an article right there. That does bring our discussion to a close. Thank you to the three of you so much for a fantastic conversation. Thank you to all of you in the room and for really wonderful questions that came through. I wasn't able to get to all of the questions, and so I apologize if you asked a really fantastic question. They all were fantastic, and we couldn't cover it. I'd encourage you to keep chatting afterwards. Also, there are hard copies of the reports out there. If you haven't already grabbed one, please do. Also, please be on the lookout for some additional publications that we'll have coming as part of this study. We will also have pieces coming out about what do America's allies want in arms control, what are potential off-ramps for escalation, and how can Europe play a stronger role in the arms control landscape. So this conversation, I hope that this is the beginning of the conversation. It certainly is not the end. The final piece is a big thank you to the CSIS team. As always, the CSIS AV team is fantastic and helped us all get here and move along smoothly. And then big thank you to the PONI team, especially Catherine and Lachlan and Nico, partners in crime on this really fantastic and fun project. And obviously, thank you to our sponsors, the UK Foreign Office. So that includes our event, but thank you all so much again, and please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers.